Great. So admitting people now. Hello to the people who are joining us on the Zoom room. I'll just give it another minute while we're waiting for some more people to join us, but of course we can admit people at any time during this event, so we will do that. Welcome to people who are arriving. If you are in Brisbane, you will notice that it's cold for one. Not a very common phenomena for Brisbane, but we are told that it's going to drop down to some ridiculously chilly 4 degrees tomorrow night, which I don't remember that happening in Brisbane before. So that'll be a really interesting thing to see if we all have to put the heater on and blow our power out. We'll see if we're all in the dark tomorrow. But yes, so as people are entering the room, I'll just let you all know that you will be on mute for the duration of the event tonight. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to Unsheltered that you can purchase from Avid Reader, and it's coming your way in the chat function. And that is my sneaky way of selling books, as well as where you're going to be able to ask questions. So that chat function there is where you can ask questions at any time during the event, because I will be voicing them for you at the end of the event. So you can ask your questions at any time during the event tonight. So please feel free, if you think of something, just to type it in, and I'll line it up for the end of the event. Right, well, I will start proceedings off, and then we'll just let people in as they come. But I'd like to start the event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And also to acknowledge that because this is Zoom, we are zooming out onto the traditional lands of many, many different Aboriginal people. And this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, the oldest on the planet. And we feel incredibly privileged to be able to continue a tradition that has been going on for over 60,000 years. An amazing tradition from the storytellers in this land. So a couple more people just joining us now, and I'll just re-mention that your chat function tonight, which is at the bottom of the screen, is where you can click on and just ask us questions at any time, which I will then be able to voice when we go to question times. And for those people who've just joined us, here is the link again to the book Unsheltered by Clare Moleta. And that is for purchase at Avid Reader. We will send that to you wherever you are, or you can pick it up at the shop if you are a Brisbane person. So on that note, I will now hand over to the wonderful Dr. Debra Adelaide, who is the author or editor of over 10 books, including several reference works on Australian women writers, as well as themed anthologies, such as the acclaimed Mother Love series. She's also worked as a researcher, editor, and freelance writer, and for several years was the Sydney Morning Herald's weekly In Short book reviewer. She has published 3 novels and is Associate Professor in Creative Writing at the University of Technology, Sydney. It's my great pleasure to hand over to Debra Adelaide tonight. Welcome, Debra.
Thanks very much, Chrissy. Thanks for the introduction and the welcome. It's great to be here. Lovely to see avid readers. And I'm coming tonight from Bidjigal country, which is sort of in the inner southwest of Sydney, New South Wales. And it's a huge pleasure to come and do this event for this book in particular tonight, which is such an extraordinary book. I'm just going to introduce Clare, and then we will move into a reading of the book. Well, no, Clare will actually just very briefly describe the book without giving too much away for those of you who've not yet read it. but she'll be saying just enough to make you want to rush out and buy it. And then Claire's going to do a brief summary, a brief reading from the novel, and then we'll move into some questions. There'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions afterwards, so do make a little note now of anything you want to ask. So Clare Moleta was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but she was raised on Whadjuk Noongar country in Western Australia. Clare's fiction has been published in a number of different literary journals and also been broadcast on Radio New Zealand. Clare has a writing diploma and she also has a master's in creative writing. And she now lives back in Aotearoa in Wellington. Paniki, is that the correct pronunciation?
Pornike.
Pornike, no, not correct at all. Back where she was born. And Unsheltered is her first novel, and what an extraordinary first novel it is. Congratulations, Clare, on this book, and welcome to this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Debra, and nice to see you all here. And I should also, I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and custodians of country all across Australia, and also to tangata whenua here, where I am in Pornike, which is just at the bottom of the North Island in Aotearoa. So I need to tell you a little bit about the book. It's basically a story about a mother searching for her daughter. Lee is looking for her 8-year-old child, Matti, who has gone missing. And the search takes place across a country that is, I suppose I've described it as Australian, but not Australia. I think of it as sort of hovering just above Australia. So it's the conditions under which this mother is searching for this child are really difficult. Weather is worse. Pretty much everything is worse. And this is a woman who has no support, none of the sort of conventional structures that we would expect now to help us in these situations. And she's someone who's very resourceful and resilient. And the story effectively, after some setup, is of her journey searching for Matti, and of the things that happen to her, and I suppose the ways that she changes through that story. And I think it's unfamiliar, but I hope it's also familiar. It felt very familiar to me when I was writing it. That's hopefully enough to say as far as the setup goes. And I was going to read a bit to start with. And this is a bit I haven't read before, and it came up out of talking to Debra. So it's about 70 pages in, and I think at this point Lee has been looking for her daughter for about a week, maybe a little less. And when she's not walking, she remembers things. Actually, when she's walking, she remembers things too, because you think when you walk. So this is a memory that she has at one point when she stops on the walk. Flu had gone through mate camp like a truck. Headache, bone ache, sweats, then a fever. By the time Lee understood what was happening and tried to quarantine Matti from the other kids, it was too late. For the first 24 hours, she thrashed in a sleeping bag, panting and crying out. She held on to the horse and made high, whimpering sounds. Lee gave her the last of the antivirals, tried to regulate her temperature, make her drink. Matti cried out that the fire was coming and Goldie was on fire. She asked for ice blocks and watermelon, for Frank. People left Lee food, refilled the water bottles she left outside the tent. Sana and Amen, Abraham, a few others she'd shared kill with or patched for on the quiet, building up credit against exactly this kind of contingency. Sana stayed to give her news through the nylon shell. Her family had survived the flu already. She said bodies had been removed from the camp and burned within sight in the no-go. The people who did it weren't relief. They were outsiders in hazard suits and masks. That wasn't good. It meant mate camp was on someone's radar. Sumud or Port Howell authorities getting nervous about an epidemic on their doorstep. The med tent had run out of antivirals and disposable masks. They were waiting on a new aid dump. Lee breathed Matti's air and willed herself not to get sick until Matti got through it. Now her daughter lay still and glassy, and Lee watched the work of her breathing, counted through the pauses to the restarts, held her own breath, watching that thin chest as if the act of witness alone could keep Matti's lungs working. Matti's hair was even shorter since the last outbreak of lice, and streaky with sweat, making her unfamiliar. She'd lost another tooth, and a big one was already coming. It had changed her face again. She kept changing. Lee saw how beautiful she was. She looked and looked. It was so easy to love Matti when she was still like this, when the furious concentration of herself made no demands, resisted nothing, insisted on nothing. On the third morning she cooled and her breathing became easier. She drank, then slept again, but quietly. The heaviness Lee felt was barely recognisable as relief. She let it pull her down beside her child and slept with her. Late in the day, Matti sat up and asked for food. There was almost nothing left. Whatever Lee had caught would be rotting in the snares. She needed to get out there to empty and reset them so they would have something to trade in the coming days. If she left now, she could be back soon after dark. She explained this to Matti while she lined up the water bottles and the 2 cans of beans within reach. Matti said, "Don't go tonight, Mum." "I won't be long. You just need to drink water and go to sleep. I'll ask Sana to check on you." "What if you are long?" "Then you wait for me at the kids' tent." Matti kept shaking her head. Lee could feel a kind of lethargy coming on that would make it too hard to do anything but lie down beside her. And so she was hard on Matti, her strong child who had survived. She thought it would make her angry, and the anger would make her turn away, make leaving easy. But Matti followed her all the way to the fence.
Thank you so much, Claire. And partly I asked Claire to read something from the novel because I wanted you to hear the beautiful quality of the prose, which is terse and clipped, but also very poetic in lots of ways. And I think that captured it. There's also a great deal in that section that you read that's familiar. And I'm just going to start with the very, very obvious. So this is a scene in which the child Matti has a flu, and a really serious flu. There's shortage of medical equipment mentioned, a great urgency about the flu, a sense that, you know, it could all go very bad very quickly. Later in the novel, there's a similar event, in fact, a much worse one, and Lee herself is sick. And of course, I have to ask this, how did you know about COVID before it happened? Because presumably you weren't writing this last year. Presumably you had conceived of this and were writing it quite a long time ago.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, until you brought that question up, I think I can honestly say I'd never really thought about it. I definitely didn't conceive of anything in advance. I wrote the first draft in 2017, and all I was trying to do then was build the world that I saw out of the things that I heard and that I read and that I knew about, and make it as real as possible and give consequences to things that happened. I wanted to follow through on everything that was in there as best I could. And Matti and Lee, early on in the book, are in this place called a mate camp, which is a kind of a refugee camp, sort of unofficial camp outside the walls of a safer place, or what they believe is a safer place. And that camp for me, or the idea of those camps, was very much based on places like the Calais jungle, and a lot of other places, but that that was a place that was in the media a lot, and so it was possible to read a lot about it and to watch videos and to hear a lot of the detail and the sort of daily life in the camp and how things worked. And flu and sickness just seemed entirely logical. I mean, it just seemed like, in that case, just one small piece of a puzzle, you know, of what you get when you cram people together and they're sick and they're malnourished and they're not protected from anything and they're not protected from each other and they don't have, you know, all of those things. I mean, that just seemed like that's what that was. And it was also a plot driver, you know, it's a kind of impetus for the two of them to get separated. Mm-hmm. And then the scene that you talk about later in a different kind of camp, which is actually a labour camp. Mm. Again, you know, it was a plot driver. It sort of triggers another set of events. But once again, it just seemed like the more I wrote into that scene and the more I read about places like that from a long time ago through till now, is that those kind of epidemics are just par for the course, you know. Mm. But it's funny because when I thought about your question, I realised that there's even another thing in the book that also talks about that, which is one of the pieces of background to this world is this sort of ongoing war over resources, you know, somewhere in the north, and we don't find out a whole lot about it. But there's a sort of a little piece later in the book where we hear a little bit about maybe how that happened and what that was like for someone who was there. And again, there are these stories of people dying on the front lines in what really sounds more like the First World War than any idea of a kind of futuristic war. And again, people are dying of flu and they're dying of dysentery and they're dying of all these things for all the same reasons. And I guess that's just what I saw. You know, I didn't have any foresight. It just seemed normal, you know. But I have heard Laura Jean McKay being interviewed on the same question, talking about the animals in that country, and being asked again, how did you know? Because, you know, this idea of a flu and the effect on people is much more sort of central and all the way through her book. And it's interesting because likewise she sort of says, oh, you know, I didn't know. But she does have real life experience. She'd been an aid worker, so she did have an understanding of how epidemics, if not pandemics, worked. Whereas for me, I certainly wrote it all before any of this stuff happened. But it was kind of interesting. I was doing some final tweaking and revision during our lockdown last year. And I remember there were just a few tiny, tiny things that kind of I was able to shade in, mostly about people keeping their distance from each other, that seem so obvious now. Yeah. You know, that didn't seem quite so obvious then. You know, I hadn't imagined it fully enough, I think.
Well, it certainly seems extraordinarily prescient. And it's interesting you mentioned the animals in that country, which I've only just read that myself just a few days ago. And again, I thought, how did Laura Jean McKay know? How did she know? But when in the scenes where Lee catches this raging, awful flu herself, that's when it was particularly coming home to me, because the scenes there are quite graphic, and you know, people are dying left, right, and centre, and there are no resources. You know, bodies are just being taken out and piled up because you know the medical staff are so pressed. That's when it really hit home to me, just how extraordinarily relevant it was in the context of what was happening, not in Australia, thank goodness, but what was happening in other countries.
Yeah. Well, we're in a slightly different position to nearly everyone else, aren't we?
We are, but you know, you've mentioned the refugee camps, the Make camp, which is, yes, clear in the novel that it's a temporary refugee camp, and indeed it's so temporary that it's just sort of blown apart before Lee understands what's really happening. Just not literally blown apart, but you know, attacked and dismantled. And again, we can see parallels with what's happening in the world right now. So there are so many parallels with our current political, health, environmental crises and challenges. And I'm interested to know how this played out as you were writing, as you conceived of the novel, and as you continued to develop the story. I guess what I mean is, did you commence with the idea that you would essentially write this dystopian allegory that would touch on all these issues in the world? Or did you start with the basic story of this woman who loses her child, and then it gathered dimensions and built up as you continue to write?
Yeah, that one.
That one.
It's funny. I'm slowly coming around to the idea that this is a dystopia. It's weird the things you don't think about or withhold from yourself when you're writing something, I suppose. But I completely started with the idea of this mother and child, and with the idea of an ambivalent mother. That was something I really wanted to explore. And with this,
we'll come back to that too. Actually, that's a really important thing. We'll come back to that.
And I had this sort of, I had this image in my head for quite a while before I wrote it, of these children who were walking. This book was called Children Walking in my head for a really long time, and they were some sort of pilgrimage or something. I didn't really know what they were, but I just saw them walking and being kept out of everywhere and kind of circling back, and I kind of saw the continent failing around them, and I didn't know what the continent was and I didn't know what the children were. But at some point I decided that those two things went together, and that the story I wanted to follow was somebody looking for these kids. You know, anything from the Pied Piper to, I was a Catholic child, I had a really strong Catholic upbringing, and I remember going to see a play about the Children's Crusades when I was young, and I was much older before I really had any understanding of what crusades were, But in that, my childish idea of it was this sense that children were atoning for the sins of adults, and there was a sense that of that kind of Pied Piper thing again, that the children were gone and they were sort of a haunting for the grown-ups. So that was what I wanted to write about, and the world was just the world I see. This is it's not the first book I've written, but it's the first book that I've got to the point of publishing. And so, probably everything I've worried about in the last 20 years or so is in this book to some extent. I wanted it to be as real as it could be, and I suppose there's that Margaret Atwood idea that the toads in your imaginary garden have to be real. And I didn't really feel the need to invent any of that, because it mostly to me all seems to be here. If it's not in Australia, it's somewhere. And I don't know, I wanted to reflect all those things, but I certainly didn't set out to create a parable or to address topical issues or whatever. It's just, I don't know. I mean, if anything, I felt like the world was running ahead of me. I wrote the first draft in 2017, and it took about 3 years or so before I got an agent, before I got an agent for it. And in that time, everything in the news was overtaking the story. There was a bushfire scene in the book, which is not in there anymore. You sort of hear about this fire that destroyed their hometown, but you don't see the fire. There was that scene, and I wrote it in 2017, and it was based on 2 very specific fires in southwest Australia in sort of 2013, 2014 that I had, that was sort of near where my dad lived, down south, in the southwest. And late last year, an editor told me that she thought I needed to cut that scene because of Australia's year of fire. She just said, people don't need that scene. They will know exactly what you mean as soon as you refer to it, and you're not going to touch on people's experience there. It was redundant. And my fear was that more things were going to be redundant, which sounds like a stupid fear to have, given the things I'm worrying about. They're a lot bigger than this book. But I guess that if it's a dystopia, then the dystopia is here already. It's just not evenly handed out yet.
Well, that's very bleak, I have to say. And I totally get your challenge with that word dystopian fiction, because I sort of struggled as well, but I couldn't think of an alternative term to use.
That's what it is.
And in a sense, it's also speculative fiction, but it's not speculative fiction. It's not science fiction in any way, shape or form. And you've mentioned a few times how you tried really hard to respond to things that were happening in the world and how you wanted to make things real. And I think that's a key part of why this book is so powerful for me, is because there is this great sense of familiarity in this bleak, hostile, incredibly difficult world where, you know, Lee just has to fight for everything, absolutely everything. A place that's just ravaged in terms of environment, but also morally and economically and politically. It's all frighteningly familiar. I mean, just one little example, and I am coming to a question. One little example is when she's got to log on to the equivalent of Centrelink, and just like a Centrelink is one of those weird, horrible double-speak George Orwellian words anyway. And I forget the name of the entity. You can tell us, of course, but you know, and it's just like anyone who's ever had to deal with Centrelink, you know, whose phone credit might be running out, which is always the poorest people in society, who just nearly get to the end of the queue and then their credit runs out, or they've gone to an internet cafe and, you know, they've been sitting there for 2 hours and then that's it. They're just cut off. There's no answer. So that's frighteningly familiar. Fortunately, not to me personally anymore, but I remember having to be on the phone, you know, for an hour to send to them early in the morning. That detail is that's totally convincing, so authentic, and yet it's in this world that is not our world. So the question I'm finally coming to is, how did you get all that right? And were you consciously working hard to get that right, to make sure it all fitted together? Because it is all perfectly fitting together. We get a really powerful sense of the nuts and bolts of this world that you've invented.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it's great that you feel like that happened. It was really hard. I mean, it was the biggest challenge of the book for me. I mean, of course, I suppose structured mostly is, but because I wasn't interested in world building for the sake of it, I had really no interest in that. Not that I don't think it's an interesting thing to do, and I certainly did a lot of it, but I didn't want to present that. Partly because I didn't think it was what the book was about, and partly because I thought so much of it was self-evident that it didn't really need explaining, and partly because it's close third. It stays in close to the main character, so you can only know what she knows and what she's ready to think about and what she has time to think about. And you know, people don't go around explaining the backstory of their world to themselves, you know, like, or kind of, I mean, they don't do that. That's one of those basic problems you have when you have to try and, you know, exposition. So, I mean, that in itself was harsh. And then, and then it was the human story I was interested in presenting. And that's what I wanted to focus on. But of course, although what's in my world is just, you know, a version of how things could go. Of course, it's my version, so it is slightly different from other people's versions. And, you know, I do have really clear ideas about things that happened in the background to make things be the way they are. Trying to figure out how much of that to put forward and how much of it to just allow to slip and how much of it to never reveal was really difficult. And it took me a few years to get right, because I didn't start writing the book at the beginning. I sort of jumped in sort of once Lee is on the road, and there's a decent amount of setup before that, 50 pages or something. And I sort of wrote sequentially from once she's on the road to the end of the book, and then I had to go back and start it. And it really took me a long time, because I think for a long time people were just too confused. I'd sort of jumped in and they didn't know enough, and they didn't know enough to hold on to. And it was really only, I think, at one point I had tens of thousands of extra words sort of about Lee and her partner and the child, and how they get to the point of separation, and all of these things that happen to them on the west of the continent, and all this stuff, you know. But fundamentally, that wasn't the story. I think with some help from a really amazing freelance editor, last year, I worked out that I needed to just explain a few things at the beginning, and so I used this strange little scene that I'd written right at the start of writing the book, and I wanted to start the book with it. It's this scene where Matti, the child, and her best friend, when they're about 5 or 6, are playing in stormwater pipe. But they don't know what a stormwater pipe is. They haven't seen rain, so they don't know what it's for, and then it rains. Which was just something from my childhood. Or, you know, I played in stormwater pipes when I was a kid. And I knew I wanted to start the book with that, and I had no idea why. And finally, after a few years, it occurred to me that that was a place where I could build in a little bit of explanation about some aspects of the world through the father talking to the child and through a few other things. And I tried to do it without showing the gears too much. And then I just thought, well, once I've done that, hopefully that's enough for people to just trust that I know what makes this world, and you'll find out more if you stick around. But yeah, it was a real challenge to piece all that together. And yeah, there's a lot that I just pulled out because I thought it was slowing the plot down.
Well, that opening section is a really memorable one, and it does set up a whole lot of things really nicely without you realizing it at the time. Because I remember when I went back and reread it thinking, oh yeah, that kind of established the family situation. It set up the dynamic between this little family, Frank, Lee and Matti, introduced us to the tensions within the relationship, to Lee's ambivalence about being a mother, which is such an important part of the entire novel. I think it's amazing how you put it together, actually.
Thanks.
It's so hard to know what to leave out, but it's so important to do that. And one of the things I think that makes the book so powerful is the fact that you don't explain any of this. You just say, you describe, you know, from, as you say, from Lee's point of view, this is what she's doing, this is what she's thinking. Obviously, she's not going to explain what patching is. Patching is part of her world. And I think it's a really, as I said, a really powerful aspect of the novel that you let us work that out for ourselves, because it means we're part of that world too. So that's actually, when you mentioned the beginning, that you've got a disaster, then it's also very ironic that in this land that's so drought-stricken, water isn't actually the solution. Every time there's water, there's also disaster too. And there are really, really dreadful things happening in this novel, not just in the world that the novel is about, but also to Lee personally. I mean, I think just about everything that can go wrong does go wrong to this poor woman.
Yeah.
And I've been talking about this novel to so many people, and mostly people say, well, it sounds really bleak. I have to say, and to the readers here at this event, I did not find this novel bleak at all, because of this commitment Lee has to finding her daughter. And it's this faith that she has through the novel that's challenged from time to time, but is never knocked off her at all, that she will find this daughter of hers. And that is, to me, a really positive thing. So I wondered if that was your approach too. Is that how you felt when you were writing the novel? If not, what stopped you from sort of collapsing into despair?
Yeah, it is how I felt. I'm so glad that you didn't find it hopelessly bleak, because that's a conversation I'm having here as well when I talk to people. And it might just be that I know the material really well, but that's not what I take out of it. And I think although when I went into it and started writing it, it did feel that I was writing about a lot of things that I despair about and that make me angry or make me sad or make me question my faith in everything. The people in it, I did find, because Lee's on her own a lot of the time, I spent a lot of time finding ways to bring other characters in, or finding ways to have her meet other people and interact with other people, which was a way of keeping it interesting for me and hopefully for a reader, but also a way of showing the world and possibly also countering Lee's perspective on the world, because she, at the start of the book and for quite a long way through, is not a hopeful person. She doesn't have faith in anybody really much. She did have faith in her partner, and there are maybe one or two other people, significant people in her life that she trusted and believed in, but she doesn't have faith in the world at large for very good reasons. And aside from this ferocious commitment to finding her daughter, she doesn't rate herself as a parent either. She spends most of the time thinking about all the things she did wrong, and and she did do a lot of things wrong. That's parenthood. And so all of those things, you're in her head. So when she's not sort of in a panic, she's beating herself up, or she's regretting something, or whatever. And so it was really important, until the book was able to change her, or until things were able to act on her that might make her feel a bit differently, that other people would have a different perspective. One of those characters for me is Rich, who comes in at the beginning and then is a really important character later on, who just has a really different approach to almost everything from Lee, who's also been shaped by really hard circumstances and in some ways quite similar circumstances. He has a very different feel about home, about country, about all kinds of things from her. And he does just have this stubborn streak of hopefulness and generosity and humour. Fair to say Lee's not a very funny character. So it is important that there are some other people who have that. And so there's a whole range of characters who help her kind of almost against her will. It's so hard for her to recognise kindness when she sees it. And although there are people who behave terribly, and there are opportunistic people, and there are flat out bad people, there are also all these people who just surprise you with their goodness, with their desire to do something for someone with no strings attached. And Lee having to come to see that and actually accept it was one of the real pleasures for me of writing the book. She shoots herself in the foot because she just doesn't trust anybody. So there was all of that, which for me was pleasurable to write. And then Lee herself changes, I think, really slowly, but through all kinds of things, through interactions with other people, through the country that she moves through. I think the land and the landscape has a really big effect on her. And I didn't find it hopeless. I think that in this world, people might not see any way that they can change the big picture. I feel like that ship has sailed in this version of the world. But, there's love, there's kindness, there's what's left when you think there's nothing left. And I guess that was one of the questions for me in writing it, and something I was thinking about all the way through. What doors remain open? What possibilities are there still when the worst things are happening? If you're a parent and you have no faith in the future, then what does that mean? And it has to mean something. And so I wanted to keep those questions open, and I don't come out of the book feeling hopeless, I guess, is what I could say.
And as I said, I don't either, and I've now read it twice, and I feel even more strongly that there's a great sense of hope, especially at the end, which is nicely ambiguous, and we won't spoil any of this, of course, by talking about the end any more than that.
But I do think that it seems to me that the way people read that ending has a huge impact on how they see the whole book, which makes sense. But it's taken me a little bit by surprise talking to people, the different takes on the ending, and therefore, how that colours everything else that they go back and look at or think about. It's also what you bring to a book, I think.
Yes, it is. It's right. And Lee, you explained she's a difficult character. She's very prickly. She's very hard to like.
Yeah.
But for me as a reader, that's a much more interesting character. than someone who's the opposite.
Yeah.
And as the story unfolds, we start to get fed little bits of information through the flashbacks as to why she is as she is, and it all starts to make enormous sense. So we were going to talk a little bit more about the parenthood in the novel, because that's just a very key theme running through it. And as you say, she's a very reluctant mother, and part of her flashbacks or memories of Frank was how he was the great father. He was the real parent. He was the one who embraced the role of fatherhood much more than she had. But he had more optimism generally than her. So as a representation of motherhood, Lee is a very, very interesting character indeed. And again, I'm interested to know if that was something quite deliberate, or did it just evolve as you were writing?
No, I definitely went into it wanting to write about a mother. I thought if I was going to write a story about a mother searching for a daughter, I didn't want to write one of those stories about a mother searching for a daughter, if you know what I mean. I was very interested, after I had a child and I started paying more attention, I started going looking for mothers in books in a way that I hadn't before. And not just in books, but just in the world. I wanted to see women who had children that I understood. And I just was seeing all these representations that I found astounding. I kind of, I'd considered myself a feminist from late childhood, so it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but it was amazing to me to see the simplistic ways that women who procreate were portrayed in our culture, in ways that I probably hadn't been anywhere near as aware of as I should have. And so if I was going to have a mother searching for a child, first of all, I didn't want that to be the only thing there was to see about her. And there were all these cliches that you sort of have to tick off about selflessness and, eternal love and all of these. There are all these things that women are just supposed to feel and have when they have kids. And I don't know, I don't think it's like that. I think it's very complicated. And
Matti herself is very difficult to love at times.
Sure, yeah,
really
she's she's really she's entirely her own self. And I mean, she has sort of her dad's sense of optimism. She has that strong will, from her mother, and that stubbornness that, and she has all this stuff of her own as well. And she's not going to be moulded, and she's not going to fit into any of that. And Lee, first of all, didn't want a child because she doesn't see a future, and she sort of sees that as a betrayal, really, to have a child in this world. And so then she feels that she betrayed herself because she sort of has this child against her better judgment because this man that she loves is hopeful. But that's the aberration. Then she goes back to thinking, what have I done? Why did I do this? And everything that she sees seems to back up this idea that she did make a mistake. And whereas he is open-hearted from the start, she's fighting herself. She does love her kid. And I think you see that in all kinds of ways. But
she can't love herself either, so that makes it hard.
No.
And she hasn't been mothered herself. And again, we get fed all this quite gradually, so it's not like it's not very obvious what's going on at all.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. And I think it was difficult. I did not so much when I was writing the book, but I did have early readers who found that really difficult, and who found her nature and the way she behaves with other people really problematic. And I think we're just worried that people wouldn't like her, which is a particular pressure, on a woman as a character, and maybe on a woman as a writer too. That you have to.
It absolutely is a really huge pressure, but I think you've totally pulled it off. And as a reader, that to me is a much more interesting and satisfying character than many.
Oh, thank you.
I am looking at the time. So Chrissy, is
Yes.
it about time to move to questions if anyone has them?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone has any questions, we've got one comment which I would like to read out here as well. But before I do that, and allowing people time to type their questions in, I'm really interested in the fact that you mentioned, Claire, that you had this wasn't the first book that you had written, but it's the first book that is published. And I want to ask you a little bit about those dead soldiers along the road.
The things in my drawer.
Yeah, how did it? How was it? How many books has it taken you to get to this point? And are you still going back to those and making them into?
Well, it's really, I think it's only two, so I can't, it's not like I've got dozens of them. And because you have to come up with answers to questions when you do sort of publicity, which is a really new thing for me, I've sort of developed this thing where I say, I wrote this bad short story collection in my 20s, and then I wrote this book for kids in my 30s. Which sort of belies all the heartache involved in those. The short story collection just wasn't very good. I published a few of the stories, and it never really occurred to me to try and do anything more with that. But it was certainly a book's worth of stuff. When I moved here in my early 30s, I started trying to write a great big novel for kids of the kind that I had loved myself, so probably quite an old-fashioned book, as it turned out, when I tried to publish it. Set here, it's really the only thing I've written, or one of the only things I've written sort of really set in Aotearoa. And I spent about 8 years on it. And I taught myself to write a book, I think. I wrote it sort of around having a kid and doing all kinds of other things. And eventually I sent it off and had one of those things where a publisher was sort of interested on and off for about 6 months, and then eventually said no. And when they finally said no, it was for really great reasons. Somebody wrote to me and explained all the structural problems and how I hadn't really written a book for kids. I'd written a book for adults with child characters, which was absolutely devastating, but I could see that they were right. And the suggestions they made for how I could make that work as a kid's book didn't really interest me. So I put it aside, but it was definitely an impetus for this book, because the ideas for this one were brewing. But what I realised was that I didn't want to go through that process again and get to the end and have the same result. And so what I did was I applied to a Master's in Creative Writing at a creative writing course where I'd worked in the office for about 8 or 9 years, and it hadn't really occurred to me to do that. And so I spent 8 years on that book, I think, and I spent 8 months writing the first draft of this book. And what I realised when I started was that I'd given myself a head start, because although it was a completely different genre, I'd taught myself to write things like plot and character and action, whereas before that I used to write small stories based on an idea I'd had, that would get to about 800 words and then they'd be done. So I think that's what that book was for. I do think about it now and then, because I did love it, and maybe at some point I could go back, but I'm trying to write another one now, which is again for adults. So I think that could be, I don't know, maybe one day.
That's good. There's another craft question actually come in from Debra. In your writing process, how much was the plot planned? And in particular, the idea that Lee would find Matti, was that like something in your head the whole way or not? Or
I had no idea. I didn't know until I wrote the scene what was going to happen there. And as far as the plot goes, I knew it was a quest, and it was mostly geography. Most of my plotting was geography. I had some images of places that had been very significant to me when I lived in Australia, places I'd spent time in that I had strong memories of, and I sort of pieced them together in this weird map of Australia with all these missing bits. So I knew I wanted her to cross water, so I had to invent some water. I knew I wanted her to spend time camping in a dry salt lake. I wanted her to spend time in a labour camp that had been an airport, because I read about this camp in Greece that was, whereas, you know, thousands of refugees stuck in this place that had been an airport, which just seemed like this extraordinary piece of irony that you couldn't make up. I wanted a mountain crossing. So I had all these ideas, and I sort of mapped them a little bit, and really that was my plot. And I wrote the whole thing in a state of unknowing, and I had an amazing supervisor. Supervision was new for me. I hadn't done anything like that before. And I used to go to this woman, Emily Perkins, and say to her, I still don't know how it ends. And she said, that's fine. It's keeping it alive. As soon as you know, it's dead. So I really didn't know. And I think that helped me. And I still remember the state of mind I was in when I got to the end, and kind of realising that I thought I knew how it was going to finish. And it was an extraordinary feeling, but it was like I had to get right through the book to work that out.
And a question from Cassie. What was your favourite part to write about in this book?
Hi, Cassie. It sounds bad to admit it, but I loved writing some of the really grim, hard stuff. It was sort of like, you know, when you throw lots of problems at a character, it's great as a writer, you know, so action scenes where there was massive tension, scenes where I couldn't work out how I would get her out of the situation. Those scenes were fantastic to write because they were hard for me. And there's a kind of a miracle that happens at the Salt Lake, at the dry lake, that was kind of amazing for me. You know, sometimes there's a bit you write where it kind of comes out of the book and it's like something else. And I kept wondering, am I allowed to have this stuff in the book? And so there were a few sort of slightly odd things that just stayed in and kind of broke me out of the rhythm of what I was writing. And that sort of miracle scene, I guess, was like that. And there was one really weird scene that I loved, which was where Lee has to make a speech, because Lee doesn't talk much. You know, she's kind of like a cowboy. Someone described her as a cowboy, and I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, if she was a man, that's what people would call her. And at one point, I thought she's been really broken down and absolutely devastated by grief, and she's kind of at her lowest point and therefore her most vulnerable. And I thought, what if in this state she gets into a situation where she has to stand up in front of people and talk? And so I tried to make her give a speech, and it was amazing. It was hard to do, but I still remember the fun of writing that scene, of having Lee talk a lot.
And there's a question here about the cover, and the cover come from in the image.
Yeah, can people see? I don't know if you can. Yeah, that. It's beautiful, isn't it? My publisher Ben Ball, who was amazing for me because I'm very inexperienced in all of this stuff, and he's incredibly experienced. At some point, he just read the book so closely, and at some point he sent me this list of images he'd pulled out of the book that were ideas for a cover. Some of them would never have occurred to me, but a fairly persistent one was the idea of trapped things, hunted things, roadkill, because that's a lot of the way that Lee survives through the book. You know, she's highly skilled at all that stuff. And Sandy Cull, the designer, found this image by an artist called Kate Brakey, who I've been saying is American. I think that's right. This is her image, this hair. And so it's a very literal image. But I think I love it too because it's so vulnerable. And because for some reason it reminds me of Matti. It reminds me of the kid. It kind of almost looks like Matti has this horse that she loves, that she loses in the fire at the beginning, and then her dad makes her a wooden horse. And that's the most precious thing for her. And for some reason that reminds me of that, this dropped toy, without actually being a child on the cover, which I didn't want. I didn't want people on the cover because I worked very hard not to describe anyone in the book physically as much as I could, and I wanted to leave that to people's imaginations. So, yeah, so I think the cover is absolutely beautiful, and I think the combination of Sandy Cull's design and Kate Brakey's image works beautifully. And I love this. That's my favourite bit. There's a hair on the spine as well.
It's beautiful, beautiful jacket, and very striking, and not like anything that's out at the moment, which makes it stand out.
Yeah, right.
There's a comment here, which I normally don't read comments, but this one's really interesting because it's from Debra, and it talks about how we read and how our relationship to a book changes. So I'm going to read it out. Debra says, I think now that this is an extraordinary read, but I dislike the first bit of it, feeling uncomfortable at the writing style, battling the lack of speech marks for dialogue and grating against the harsh dystopia. But when I stopped for the night, thinking enough was enough, the character had sunk in and I even dreamt about it. So the next day I had to press on. My estimation now is that it is utterly superb writing. The story is described on the blurb as relentlessly propulsive and profoundly moving, and I could not agree more. And I love that. I love that comment about reading, because sometimes, it's hard as a writer to know how your readers are going to engage with the work. And that idea that, something that is so hard for someone to read at the beginning can become impossible not to read by the end, I think is a really lovely thing.
That's really lovely to hear, because I think it is part of the challenge, isn't it? When you put your character through hard things, how much you're going to put your reader through hard things, and how close you want to hold them to the character in the story, and whether they're going to sort of pull back in horror or find enough that bonds them with the character and the story to keep going. I mean, for me, there is hope that kind of pulls you through too, but it totally depends on people's experience of reading it. So I do love that idea, though, that something gets under your skin that you kind of don't want to like it almost,
It's a beautiful reading, I think. And it has been really interesting to hear, Debra's reading as well of your book, and to kind of hear that engagement and that reader engagement. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. And I'm really, I think that I urge people, if you haven't read the book, to hop online. We've put the link in the comment section. Hop online and grab the book. And if you're not in Brisbane, you might think about perhaps purchasing from a Melbourne bookstore, because they're doing it really tough down there after 2 weeks of lockdown. And so I do encourage you to seek it out at a Melbourne bookstore as well if you're not local to us. So do check that out and grab a copy. But thank you both so much for being here and for discussing this extraordinary book.
I would just quickly add, don't buy one copy, but buy two. Because if you've not read it, once you read it, you will want to give it away, but you won't want to give away the copy that you've read. So please buy two copies. I promise you won't regret it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Congratulations again, Claire, on this debut. Not your first novel, but your first published novel. And
thank you so much, Debra.
We'll all be very, very keen to see what you publish next. No pressure. I'll certainly be looking out for your next book. So, yeah, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much, Chrissy, for running the event.
Thank you, Chrissy. And thanks for coming.
Thanks. See you later, everybody.
Bye.
Kia ora koutou.
Bye.